Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to all the panelists and attendees at the second annual meeting of the MEP Interest Group on Antimicrobial Resistance, with the name Investigating the Environmental Dimensions of AMR. My name is Nikolai. I'm the vice chair of this interest group. I'm very much looking forward to engaging with you all here today on this urgent health threat. First, let me provide a brief introduction to those who are unfamiliar with our interest group. After the landmark resolution, a European One Health action plan against AMR in the previous legislative term, 18 MEPs from across Europe joined forces in 2019 to establish an interest group on AMR, recognizing the key role of the European Parliament can and should play actions to tackle AMR in Europe. The interest group aims to ensure that AMR remains high on the policy agenda and that Europe is a global leader in the fight against AMR. AMR is being tackled at the level of the European Union through the One Health approach, and that increased funding should be made available to research and innovation, as well as development of national action plans. In 2021, we held our first annual meeting on the need to move to a sustainable model of food production. And today, the annual meeting sees our attention given to the development and spread of AMR in the environment, following UNEP's new summary report on the environmental dimensions of AMR and the Global Leaders Group on AMR's call to action on reducing AMR discharges into the environment and food systems. So the environment is an important factor in the development, transmission, and spread of antimicrobial resistance to humans, animals, and plants. And the discharge of drugs, in particular chemicals, into the environment is recognized as significantly worrying. UNEP details the sources contributing to rising AMR in the environment from across the antimicrobial lifespan, including pharmaceutical manufacturing, use and disposal in healthcare facilities, animal and crop farming, presence in human sewage, etc. So the report lists environmental actions needed to address this issue and emphasizes the need for international actions. So I'm very pleased to open our first panel of discussion with multi-sectoral experts who will discuss solutions to enhance the environmental sustainability of the production, use, disposal of antimicrobials, and strengthen the environmental risk assessment requirements to better mitigate AMR risks in the context of revising EU general legislation on human medicines. Our second panel discussion, again with a range of experts, will provide an opportunity to reflect on necessary and cost-effective actions in light of the Commission's revision, the lists of surface and groundwater pollutants, and rules on urban wastewater treatment. So before we begin these interesting discussions, I'm delighted to give the floor to Professor David Graham, Professor of Ecosystem Engineering at Newcastle University, England, for his expert introductory remarks on the environmental dimensions of AMR. Before I give the floor, I also want to say that in the Environment Committee, I just came out of the Environment Committee. The launch of this discussion caught me on the way to my office, but I'll make sure to provide a more boring background soon. What I do want to say is that we raised an objection at the level of the European Parliament because we think the list of medicines that is provided in the Commission's proposal is not sufficient. I think there are many groups who have problems with that. We don't see in the Commission proposal that the urgency of antimicrobial resistance is being taken seriously. So, Professor Graham, I give you the floor, and I hope to have an interesting debate today.
Yeah, thank you, Nikolai. Thank you. I was asked to provide an overview of environmental dimensions of AMR just as a point of conversation for the rest of the group through the afternoon sessions. And I've decided I'm going to provide you quite a global view at the beginning and then go back and talk specifically about Europe at the end. Next slide. Okay, I'm basically going to start from the very basics, but then talk a little bit about how the implications of environmental factors have towards AMR in a global sense. To remind you all, resistance is the ability of a microorganism to defend itself against antimicrobials and other stressors. It's a natural phenomenon, but basically based on us using antibiotics, we've actually caused the nature of the background bacteria in nature to evolve. AMR, based on our experience in working in maybe 30 countries, is that AMR primarily evolves based on and develops based on the use of antibiotics. But the transmission and spread is driven by other factors that are related to the environment. So because the primary source where development of antibiotic resistance occurs in fecal waste, how fecal wastes are managed in the environment and released in the environment is critical to understanding AMR spread. And as will be discussed in the second hour, effective waste management, therefore, is critical to reducing spread and in turns risk. Next slide. So AMR is a tricky subject, though. We've known about AMR for many years. And we've been trying to address it as a problem, but it roots at many different scales. It's basically a genetic phenomena that then is impacted by ecology at different scales. So if we think about it simplistically, AMR, how we create AMR is by exposing a bacteria or microorganism to an antimicrobial. And its therapeutic purpose is to kill the organism, but it never kills every single organism. And every time you treat a suite of microorganisms, a few survive. But those few survive are the strong ones, and they're the ones that then become dominant. And that you end up with an upward spiral of resistance based on repeated exposure. Next slide. The problem is from a management perspective and dealing with AMR in the environment, this is happening simultaneously everywhere. It's happening in medicine, it's happening in veterinary medicine, it's happening to do with the release of antibiotics or chemicals in the environment, it's related to crop production, it's related to many things happening simultaneously. And part of the problem in addressing AMR in the environment is that it's very difficult for us to identify specific sources. Without specific sources, it's hard to know how to solve the problem. And so what we've been doing, and many others in the world have been doing, is trying to come up with better ways of identifying and prioritizing sources. And that's part of my comment related to fecal matter being a dominant source. So what we want to do is, we know the environment mediates spread, and what we want to then do is reduce sources and retard pathways. Next slide, please. Now, to give you a sense of the importance of the relationship between basic sanitation and advanced wastewater treatment and the relative spread of AMR, I've got two slides together that were produced in a report that we did for the World Economic Forum that was released in 2021. And this first map shows the levels of sanitation as defined by WASH infrastructure around the world. And what you can see is that there's some areas in the world that are very dark. Functionally, there's very little infrastructure. In some parts of the world, they're very light. If you look at Europe, Western Europe, for the most part, is light. Eastern Europe, in parts, is relatively darker, but not the darkest. Now, I want you to very carefully look at the colors on the map and see how they change, because what we did also in this report looked at the potential exposure risk and related to AMR from the environment in 2030. So watch the colors. The next slide, please. So what you can see based on the color changes, some parts of the world get a lot darker. And the particularly noteworthy ones are some places in Eastern Europe, but also in India and China. And the reason for these darkening trends relative to where AMR waterborne exposure risk is highest, it's because those are places where antibiotics are used in many other different ways, non-therapeutic use in agriculture. There's other forms of pollution to the environment that amplify resistance that may be placed there based on the fecal matter that's entering the environment through waste, but it's then amplified because of all these phenomena are happening on top of each other. So what do we do about it? And the next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and it's a good news and a bad news slide. The good news relative to Europe is the slide on the left. And it's basically a really fantastic piece of work done in Denmark by DTU, where they looked at functionally the amount of AMR in the gut of individuals in each continent. And what you can see if you look at the relative positions of these boxes, the box that's got the lowest levels of AMR on a per capita basis, this based on sewage monitoring, is in Europe. So Europe actually looks very good, comparatively speaking, relative to the rest of the world. Places that have very little sanitation, like South America and Africa, tend to have very high levels of AMR. And I believe this is strictly based on how much environmental exposure happens to individuals that reside in those places. So the bad news on the slide is on the right. And this is maybe part of the discussion that should be had at meetings like today, and if you look at the AMR exposure risk in Europe, so this is focusing in on Europe specifically, you see the colors are not the same. And the reason why the colors are not the same, this is the actual AMR environmental exposure risk. Different places have got different styles and types of antibiotic use. There is incomplete coverage of wastewater management. Eastern Europe is not up to the same levels as parts of Western Europe. There's variable dilution in the receiving waters in which people live, and people can't really control this. So in Southern Europe, there tends to be greater exposure risks, partly because the waste, even treated wastes that are put into the environment, are present in the environment at higher concentrations. And finally, combined sewer overflows, which is functionally pushing raw sewage into the environment, exist everywhere. And we suspect, though I can't prove it with absolutes, is that it might be one of the main sources of AMR in the environment in places like Europe. So I'll stop there, and I'll thank the host for asking me to speak. But I would really seriously ask you to think about those 4 questions I suggested and think about it within solutions for AMR in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nikolai, for your welcome remarks and for the updates on very recent and very fresh EU developments. And thank you very much, David, for your insightful remarks and for providing a solid framework for our discussion today on the environmental dimension of AMR. My name is Kristina Prikop from the European Public Health Alliance, EPHA, and it is my pleasure to moderate the first session on behalf of the Secretariat of the MEP Interest Group on AMR. The Secretariat is co-hosted together with Healthcare Without Harm Europe and with the support of the AMR Stakeholder Network, which is a network of more than 60 leading organizations and individuals committed to tackling AMR at national, regional, and European level, covering all dimensions of the One Health approach. I'm now delighted to kick off the first session of today's meeting that will discuss solutions to enhance the environmental sustainability of the production, use, and disposal of antimicrobials. It will also explore ways to strengthen environmental risk assessment requirements in order to better mitigate AMR risks in the context of revising the EU general legislation on human medicines. We have an excellent panel today and limited time, so I would suggest directly turning to our 5 speakers. They will each give short introductory remarks, which will be followed by an interactive discussion during which we will take questions from the audience. We very much wanted this session to be as interactive as possible, so please use the Q&A function to comment and ask questions, indicating also who they should be addressed to. You also have the opportunity to engage on Twitter with the hashtag of the MEP Interest Group, hashtag MEP versus AMR, MEP vs AMR. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and that the recording will be sent to you by email and published on the webpage of the MEP Interest Group in the next few days. So without further ado, our first panelist is Pascalia Koufokotsiou, pharmaceutical and health policy expert at the European Commission's Directorate General for Health and Food Safety, DG Sante, which is in charge of revising the EU general pharmaceutical legislation for human medicines. Lina, the pharmaceutical strategy sets out to revise the manufacturing and supply provisions in the pharmaceutical legislation with a view to improve transparency and reinforce oversight of the supply chain, and also to clarify responsibilities to ensure overall environmental sustainability. How can oversight and responsibility of actors be improved to increase transparency throughout the pharmaceutical supply chain? Pascalina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me in this opening panel and giving me the opportunity to talk about the policy options to address the environmental implications of the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals in general and most specific the antimicrobials that could be effective in combating the antimicrobial resistance, which we all agree that is a very complex public health issue. I would like to, before giving you my remarks, I would like to address a question to you. What is your understanding of greener antimicrobial medicines with respect to antimicrobial resistance? Or another way to frame this question is what does it mean responsible manufacturing of antimicrobials? Many thanks to give your feedback in the chat. Now that we reflected on the definition of the greener antimicrobial medicines, I would like to address the question and give you a brief overview of the current state of play with regard to the EU legal requirements for the pharmaceuticals in the environment. Fundamentally, the environmental risk assessment as it stands in the current EU legislation provides for the risks to the environment that arise for the use, the storage, and the disposal of medicines. That means that the risks arising from the manufacturing and also risks that are specific, that specifically refer to antimicrobial resistance are not covered in the scope of the environmental risk assessment. In this regard, the Commission, now in the context of the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation and of course taking into account the EU pharma strategy, which paved the ways in which the environmental implications should be addressed. One major pathway that we are considering is to extend the scope of the environmental risk assessment in order to include both the risks from the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals and also the specific risks for the development and spread of antimicrobial resistance in the environment. However, there are three key points that I would like to draw your attention to. First is that there is a lack of consensus about the exact contribution of the pharmaceutical manufacturing to the development of antimicrobial resistance in the environment. Second is that there is no generally accepted methodology to establish emission value limits for the active pharmaceutical ingredients. And third is the good manufacturing practices that we use in the pharmaceutical supply chain in order, they focus mainly to the quality standards and they don't include so much environmental clauses. Recently, the World Health Organization has published a document which is a kind of call to manufacturers of antimicrobials, but also to inspectors that they work for the national regulatory authorities in order to raise the issue of the importance of environmental standards in the good manufacturing practices. However, in this document, there are no concrete instructions. And in the opening session of the document, there is a reference that the contribution of the pharmaceutical manufacturing to the antimicrobial resistance is limited, but there is an acknowledgement that in places of the world where the manufacturing sites of active pharmaceutical ingredients exist, this problem is much more intense. Of course, others argue in the literature that, as the professor has also showed, that the environment in the places, because actually the pharma manufacturing sites, they are divided in two main types. One is the active pharmaceutical ingredients, and the second one is the manufacturing of finished products. So in these places, actually the environment can be a cocktail with a high concentration of residues of both antimicrobials and antimicrobial resistant genes. In brief, the Commission is taking very seriously the policy option to strengthen the environmental risk assessment in the market authorization process of medicines. But we also have discussion with stakeholders and with the member states, and try to gather evidence in order to resolve these issues that I explained previously. And of course, another policy option, second, is to make mandatory the disclosure of information on the sustainability performance of all actors, of all supply chain actors, because as it is well known, the pharma manufacturing is very much scattered across the world, and many pharmaceutical companies outsource to many different suppliers that are located in different places, and of course regulated by different frameworks. In this regard, an international agreement on because GMPs have always an international dimension, an agreement on using GMPs to address the environmental implication, and more specifically the antimicrobial resistant risk, would be enormous progress. Thank you, and I will remain for further questions.
Thank you very much, Pascalia. This certainly gives us a great overview of the legislative and policy framework for our upcoming discussion. And as you encourage participants to interact, I will also do that again and remind them about the Q&A function or any comments, questions for Lina or for the upcoming speakers. For now, though, I would like to next give the floor to Sean Williams, Senior Policy Advisor at the Wellcome Trust, which recently published a new report entitled Understanding the Antibiotic Manufacturing Ecosystem. Sean, one of the questions that the report explores is what environmental regulatory options can be taken to limit antimicrobial discharge from manufacturing plants. Can you please share some of the insights with us?
Sure, thank you, Christina. Good afternoon, everyone. As Christina was saying, my name is Sean Williams, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the Wellcome Trust in the UK. And so starting off, just commenting on a few thoughts on regulatory options that can be taken to limit antimicrobial discharge from manufacturing plants. Really, when it comes to regulation, there are actually quite a few different options for how we can influence practices at a manufacturing level, and some of them can be more formal, what we might think of as more traditional regulatory approaches, but there are other options as well that we might not think of in this very formal regulatory bucket. And so I wanted to touch briefly on three of the most widely talked about options that could be opportunities to do more to limit discharge from antimicrobial manufacturing. And the first, of course, is legislation to set specific limits for antibiotic discharge coming from manufacturing plants. The critical thing to note on this one, of course, is that it only affects manufacturing sites within the relevant jurisdiction of that legislation. So regulation really to make a difference to AMR risk in the whole would be needed in countries with big manufacturing centres. A second regulatory option might be standard setting by a body like the WHO. So as the previous speaker was talking about, something like including antibiotic discharge limits in WHO's good manufacturing practice system, and this being cascaded down to countries. And as the previous speaker was saying, they have included some advice on controlling antibiotic discharge in their guidance around GMP, but it's not currently something that's formally regulated or inspected. So a lot of people are very interested in how more on the environmental side can be integrated in this side of things. And thirdly, the final option I wanted to touch on, which maybe isn't so traditionally thought of as regulation, but I think falls in this space, is something like including environmental metrics in antibiotic procurement approaches. So when you're purchasing antibiotics, favouring suppliers that demonstrate commitment to controlling environmental risk. And this is particularly an action that net importers of medicines could take. But coordination between procurers would really be needed to make sure that the system is workable and that we're creating enough influence on the manufacturing sector broadly to create change. And generally, I think it's really encouraging that there's growing interest in doing more to regulate discharge from manufacturing. As previous speakers have said, it's not always clear exactly how serious an issue manufacturing is as a source, but we do know that antibiotics enter the environment from manufacturing plants. This is already a very highly regulated and controlled industry, so there are clearly things we can be doing to stop this from happening. So it feels like a really fertile place to be focusing our attention. So I think it's great that there's more discussion on this as an issue. However, we haven't seen much decisive movement yet towards any particular kind of regulation that people are keen to take to try and stop this from happening. And this could be because there isn't yet firm agreement on which regulatory approach might be the most effective. But it could also be because we often, when we talk about this issue, hear concerns from industry that interventions to control discharge could cause us issues in the supply chain. So, for example, if new regulation drives up manufacturing costs, this could in turn push some suppliers out of the market and ultimately impact the availability and affordability of medicines. And obviously, this is something we absolutely need to avoid. But as it stands, the transparency of antibiotic supply chains is somewhat limited. And so it's very hard for policymakers, for people setting these regulations, to design those regulations, those policies sensitively to make sure that we avoid those scenarios where we see disruption in the supply chain. And so, as Christina was alluding to, in April, Wellcome published a report that we hope might encourage more confidence to act on manufacturing discharge. This study analysed the supply chains of 40 active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, to generate an understanding of just what the supply system looks like. And we then estimated the economic impact of two plausible scenarios for regulation of antibiotic discharge to understand exactly what costs would be required if those policies were brought in. And finally, we combined the supply chain mapping with the economic analysis to really assess the potential impact that potential environmental regulation might have on antibiotic supply. And really what this analysis suggested to us is that most antibiotic supply chains are resilient enough to handle AMR-driven environmental regulation of different kinds, with supply chains largely able to absorb additional costs and other shocks that might come with any changes in practice. However, we did see that some supply chains could be at risk of disruption in the face of certain kinds of regulation, particularly supply chains for antibiotics treating niche indications and last resort generics, as these supply chains for these medicines often have low profit margins and a limited number and diversity of manufacturers, which leaves them less resilient. Therefore, we recommended that any regulation is implemented in a supply chain sensitive way. And what we mean by that is just ensuring that the approach is appropriate for the supply chains it affects, really thinking about the impact that it might have on supply chains, and perhaps complementing that policy with supportive measures to really help at-risk supply chains stay resilient. We didn't make any specific recommendations ourselves on what regulatory option was most appropriate. So this could be an interesting point of discussion to hear what others think of which option might be the most viable. But we did recommend in our work 6 factors that any new regulatory option should ensure to cover to minimize risk to medicine supply. So I'll leave my comments there and hope I can share more with you on our analysis over the course of this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Han, for your valuable contribution on the different possible approaches. You made a lot of interesting points here, and I'm sure we'll be back to them during the Q&A session. Our next speaker now is Sara Sierdes, serving member of the European Parliament, member of the MEP Interest Group on AMR, and a medical doctor. Sara, the MEP Interest Group has been promoting the One Health approach in its activities, raising awareness about the importance of this principle. So what can the EU do to reinforce the One Health approach to AMR, and given the focus of today's discussion, to effectively address its environmental discussions? MEP Sara Sierdes, if you are able to hear us, and
Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here and discuss one of the biggest global health threats we have at the moment. So it's a real pleasure to be here and talk a bit what the European Union is doing to reinforce the One Health approach in regards to antimicrobial resistance and address its all environmental dimensions. Going a bit back on history, we have the 21 years ago, the Council have asked member states to recognize the need for a prudent use of antimicrobial medicines in humans. In 2001, it was well known that AMR was a cross-border health threat that will never be sufficiently addressed by a single member state alone and will never be confined to a geographical region, hence the need for intensive cooperation and coordination. Already in 2016, member states asked for a united plan against AMR in the EU, and we have seen it since 2017, which has important updates to the strengthening EU's response to AMR. However, we have not been doing enough, and the science clearly tells us so. To address AMR both in humans and animals, we must keep pushing the One Health approach and action plan in order to make the European Union an example region on protection of antibiotics, mostly on its usage, advocate for AMR to be in the global agenda, and unfortunately, due to the pandemic, AMR was a bit sidetracked, but we need to make AMR #1 priority again, and also, and lastly, but not the least, make research, development, and innovation on AMR a priority. We have that recent data from, well, it's not so recent, from 2018 from Eurobarometer, shows that even though 85% of inquiries knew that an unnecessary use of antibiotics would make it ineffective, 66% of respondents did not remember getting any information about the need not to take antibiotics unnecessarily without guidance for their doctors, or for instance, for viruses. The knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors of the public hence are of vital importance to establish and ensuring the prudent use of antimicrobial agents, but we cannot just put the whole responsibility on the citizens, hence the importance of developing better health literacy, which through coordinated policy actions can prevent the catastrophe that is just peeking around the corner of not having antibiotics as viable treatments for diseases that we can easily cure. So as I say, and I'm not painting a not so very positive scenario, but AMR is a major global health challenge with important impacts on ecosystems, animal and human health, and there's no guarantee of health, and there will never be a One Health achievement if we do not account for AMR and its different fields. So in 2019, WHO identified 32 antibiotics in clinical development that matched the WHO list of priority pathogens, but only 6 are classified as innovative. This means that the clinical pipeline of new antimicrobials is running dry, and in regards to global health, we will be reaching soon a point of no return. That means that if we don't act now and take One Health approach seriously, there will be no coming back. So AMR is not an isolated threat. For instance, this is antimicrobials are of the utmost importance for the survival rate of immunocompromised patients, cancer patients, many other elective surgeries that we have. Hence, we must reduce the quantities of antimicrobials that we use. We must reduce the release of antimicrobials to the environment by establishing effective barriers, not only in human health, but also when it comes to the animal use of antibiotics, or the use of antibiotics in animals, better said. So in conclusion, we have seen that the EU can do a lot and is taking important steps towards reinforcing the One Health approach in regards to antimicrobial resistance and to effectively address its environmental dimensions. But we need to take all this potential and make it into action and hence a reality. And we need to do it now. So this is my preliminary remarks, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Sarah, and for highlighting the importance of the One Health approach and of increased public awareness with the help of a targeted policy framework. Now for the audience, please let me remind you of the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to ask questions or make comments to Sarah or to the other speakers. Now for our fourth panelist, we are pleased to welcome Rhys Wamsley, non-clinical and environmental risk assessment expert in the Scientific Evidence Generation Department of the European Medicines Agency. Rhys, given your position, there is probably no better person to help us discuss how environmental risk assessment requirements can be strengthened to better tackle AMR. Rhys, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Christina and Jean-Yves, for the invitation to present at the forum and on this topic of strengthening the ERA with respect to AMR. But it has to be said that presently, AMR is not part of the environmental risk assessment for medicines authorizations. And that's due to, partly due to the legislation. So our ERA practices and guidelines are based on the legislation 2001/83 directive. And in that, the risks are divided into 2 buckets. So the first one are risks related to quality, safety, efficacy, or public health. And the second bucket is any risk of undesirable effects on the environment. So antimicrobial resistance is probably considered more a public health risk, while the current environmental risk assessments for medicines are performed really to look at any risks of undesirable effects on the environment per se. Our guidelines do specify for antimicrobials some tests that need to be done, but they are mainly to look at effects on algae at the low trophic level and on the functioning of the sewage treatment plant for which bacterial activity is essential. So the other thing I would say, and I would agree with Sarah, that AMR should be considered holistically within the context of the One Health perspective, and obviously should include exposure from veterinary use and manufacturing. So one of the other issues as well, although I said that the pharmaceutical legislation isn't very clear where AMR would lie presently, it doesn't exclude that it can be assessed. But as Lena said at the beginning, one of our issues is that there's no standardized methodology accepted to assess AMR in the context of the approval of human medicines. And progress needs to be made on this. So we need to find ways of developing predicted no effect values. And not only would this be useful in the context of the human ERA, but it would also be useful in the context of developing emission limits. So as Lena said also, there are currently proposals for amending the pharmaceutical legislation, and that could more clearly define what the protections goals would be for evaluating AMR and for mitigating the impact of antimicrobials on the environment generally. So how the emissions and how both from sewage plants and from manufacturing could be controlled. So I think that's all I can say, because as I said, at the moment the ERA does not include an evaluation of the AMR. And it would, although it's not excluded in the legislation, I think it would be of great benefit to clarify that in the revised legislation.
Thank you very much for sharing your insight. This is certainly a very complicated technical matter here. For now, we will move on to our final speaker for this session, who is Daria Kuruzboye, Director of Professional Development at the European Association of Hospital Pharmacists and Head of Hospital Pharmacy at the General Hospital Dr. Tomislav Bartek, Koprivnica in Croatia. Daria, according to the OECD, inappropriate use may account for up to 50% of all antimicrobials consumed in human healthcare, leading to unnecessary antimicrobial pollution. Your organizations have been actively involved in antimicrobial stewardship initiatives. So how can these be promoted to reduce inappropriate antimicrobial use in the healthcare sector? Daria, the floor is yours. But I do notice a slight technical issue with the camera.
Okay, do you see me?
Not at this moment, unfortunately.
Now? Is
now
it
you're
okay?
back, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I hope I won't be I will be also very interesting to you. I will just continue regarding the impact of hospital pharmacies regarding antimicrobial stewardship. So it's in hospitals where the human cost of antimicrobial stewardship, of antimicrobial resistance is often felt the most. Infections can travel quickly within these institutions, and the ability to prevent and treat infections is a key factor for halting unnecessary complications and deaths. It is essential for EHP, the European Association of Hospital Pharmacists, and its members that supporting hospitals to tackle the threat of antimicrobial resistance is included in a One Health approach. Multidisciplinary antimicrobial stewardship teams that involve the expertise of hospital pharmacists can help to change prescription practices and be a powerful resource for prescribers by providing a diverse set of experience dedicated to achieving the best possible patient outcomes. Their implementation is, however, still far away from being routine in European hospitals. This contrasts with scientific results of efficient reduction of antibiotic overuse, positive contributions to resistance development, and even cost savings. In the Netherlands, where antimicrobial stewardship teams exist, a significant positive impact on patient outcomes was observed, with lower rates of infections resulting in shorter hospital stays and fewer days spent in intensive care units. Therefore, by reducing the need for patients to stay in the hospital and in the ICU, antimicrobial stewardship team simultaneously improved patient outcomes while producing considerable savings for the hospitals and environment as well. In Italy, a reference model was created to introduce a so-called department pharmacist with specific infectious disease skills in hospitals, and the antibiotic stewardship training manual was further elaborated. The interventions of these pharmacists have led to an improvement in quality of care, resource efficiency, and healthcare professional awareness across Italy. In Croatia, the first antimicrobial stewardship team was piloted at the Koprivnica Hospital and was successful in decreasing the use of antimicrobials with positive impact on clinical outcomes. A project was subsequently launched to tackle the high rate of inappropriate usage of antibiotics in the country by expanding the role of the hospital antimicrobial stewardship team to educate primary care physicians on the correct use and prescriptions of antibiotics. In addition, AMR is mainly driven by inappropriate use of antibiotics in humans and animals and by suboptimal hygiene practices in healthcare settings, as David Graham from Newcastle University showed us. To address this problem, the efforts of prophylaxis like vaccination and hygiene as additional supportive measures need to be further enhanced. Prevention of infectious diseases should be strengthened by integrating vaccination planning developed for the fight against antimicrobial resistance. Existing toolkits, such as the one for healthcare professionals in hospitals and other healthcare settings of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, ECDC, and hand hygiene as the single most important prophylactic measure should be further stimulated to become an integral part of the work of antimicrobial stewardship teams. In conclusion, antimicrobial stewardship should be promoted to reduce inappropriate antimicrobial use in the healthcare sector by ensuring that all EU countries learn from each other, implementing the best practices that work well in some countries across the Union, by coupling antimicrobial stewardship with other prophylactic measures such as vaccination and hygiene. Only if everyone is doing her or his part, antimicrobial pollution can be decreased. Reducing inappropriate antimicrobial use requires behavioral changes with continuous emphasis on the importance of prudent use coming from all stakeholders, including European, national, and local governments, patients, and healthcare providers. I am ready to tackle the problem together with my hospital pharmacy colleagues as a part of antimicrobial stewardship team. Thank you.
Many thanks, Daria. Once again, very interesting points here and very valuable to hear the perspective of hospital pharmacists. A lot of food for thought from our excellent panelists, and one extra nudge to use for the audience to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. As we are now opening our first panel discussion, and I will invite all panelists from the session to turn on their cameras. And looking at the Q&A button now, I see a first question to Riz, namely, does potential new legislation on environmental risk assessments, including AMR risks, apply to products marketed in the EU or products manufactured in the EU?
Well, there isn't any, new legislation at the moment. They're just proposals. They would apply, for environmental risk assessment to products within the EU. But whether that can be extended for products manufactured outside the EU, I think that would probably be more for Lena at the Commission to respond to.
Lena, please, if you'd like to.
Yes, thank you. Well, the EU legislation applies, of course, to products manufacturing in Europe, but when a pharmaceutical company applies for marketing authorization in Europe from the European regulatory system, of course, this company should submit a dossier with many different items. One of them are details about the quality and manufacturing aspects. So that would be under assessment. But as such, if this pharmaceutical company outsource the manufacturing in different parts of the world, the only harmonization, there is no direct effect of the EU legislation, but it can be through harmonization of the good manufacturing practices.
Thank you. Well, there is actually another question specifically about GMP, so I will read that out loud. Regarding the needed regulation to limit manufacturing emissions of antibiotics, of course, there are always obstacles to design new regulation, but in other industry areas, this has been resolved within a reasonable timeline. What is being done to overcome different possible problems regarding GMP as multi-international tool to regulate emissions?
Well, I just, in my opening remarks, I mentioned the initiative from the WHO, from the World Health Organization. It's just the first step. Now, in the context of the revision of the EU pharma legislation, we first have to make the decision whether the GMPs is the best pathway, the best framework in order to address antimicrobial resistance. There are different opinions. For example, there are the inspectors from the regulatory authorities, the national authorities, which argue that the good manufacturing practices is not the best place to address this complex issue of antimicrobial resistance. But a part of the policy input, as I said in my opening remarks, there is also the technical and the scientific. Of course, there are some articles in the literature that propose a novel framework for environmental risk assessment for antibiotics, or how to establish indicators for emission controls or establish emission value limits. But the problem is that there is no consensus among all stakeholders for that. And that's when you develop regulation, you should seek to have the maximum consensus from all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So to stick with the global approach, maybe the next question is to Sean about the report that you have mentioned in your opening remarks, which identifies the need to increase supply chain transparency, and it points to New Zealand as an interesting case study. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So as laid out in the report, and as I was alluding to in my introductory comments, one of the key things that we think is another challenge facing setting regulation and policy in this space, so maybe related to the previous question as well, on another challenge we're facing we need to overcome, is the limited transparency on what antimicrobial supply chains look like, and just how that means that it's really hard for those in the policy space to really understand how to put policies together in a constructive way, and how to know what impact those policies might have, and particularly unintended consequences. And so our study used some less available data, so some data that unfortunately we're not able to share publicly, to really try and understand what antimicrobial supply chains look like. And through this, we created a picture of 3 different antibiotic archetypes for sort of characteristics of some of the supply chains that exist. And some of these were resilient to regulatory change, linked to supply chains that have a large number of diverse manufacturers available for key intermediates. We also saw supply chains with some risk, but limited risk from regulatory change, often linked to products with high profit margins, where they can absorb costs. And then there is, as I mentioned in my introductory comments, supply chains which are at more risk, where these chains have low profit margins, a limited number and diversity of intermediate manufacturers, so are less able to absorb shocks. And so it's sort of this information about what supply chains look like that can really help us understand what might happen when we put these policies in place, and start to construct policies in a sensitive way, and also put measures in place that will support strong and stable supply, even as we introduce regulation. And so the example of New Zealand is an interesting one, because the New Zealand Medicines Regulatory Agency have brought in the MedSafe initiative, which requires all approved drugs to specify the API, the DP and finished dosage form manufacturers, and the local site of product release. And so this really gives the New Zealand government a good picture of the number of suppliers at each stage. They can really identify bottlenecks and take actions to mitigate disruption. And they really just have a much clearer view of exactly what's happening in the system, and particularly on the environmental side, where potential sources of pollution might be. And so I know there are many arguments in the sector for what information can and cannot be shared publicly. I couldn't necessarily comment on what information is commercially sensitive and what's appropriate to share in the public domain, but it's a really interesting example from New Zealand, where they have been able to encourage manufacturers to share this information, to give them more information, to help them get a better view of their medicine supply system, and make sure that they can put in place policies that work the best for them. So could bring in more on the environment side, could also think more about medicine access, and stable supply chains. So it's a really nice example of something that's happening at the moment.
Thank you for sharing that, Sharon, and for the introducing also the industry perspective. And then to stick with this line of thinking then, the AMR Industry Alliance has developed an approach to establishing discharge targets for antibiotic manufacturing. Could the same methodology be used for risk assessment for selecting resistance, is a question we got. I think Lina and Riz, both of you might be able to jump in if you'd like.
Yeah, certainly for the risk assessment, I know there was a paper earlier this year from a joint paper from several companies on developing predicted no effect target concentration for antibiotics, and certainly that was an interesting article, and it should be good to sort of have more research and more debate in this area. That would certainly help in setting the methodology and developing a standardized methodology for the assessment. And that would also help in setting emission limits as well. So I think, yeah, certainly it's useful, yeah. But we do need standardized methodology and more research to have a firm basis for any ways of setting the predicted no effect concentrations.
Thank you for that answer. Lina, if you'd like to add anything to it, please let us know. But yes.
Yes, no, I agree with Riz. All the scientific developments and the research in this area is very useful, and we are following. But for the current revision of the EU pharmaceutical legislation, we need to give answers also to higher level questions, and as I explained before. And the major issue, one major concern we should not ignore that the EU regulatory system for medicines should remain attractive for developers of medicines and antimicrobials and antibiotics, especially with this emergence of the antimicrobial resistance. We need the manufacturers to develop novel antibiotics because they will be life-saving drugs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So to move a little bit away from the policy to the more practical, maybe going back to Daria, wanted to ask you, how can stewardship or disposal of antimicrobials be improved upon in a hospital environment? You've mentioned some good practices already in your introductory remarks, some good examples, but also maybe how can hospital pharmacists influence hospital stewardship in more detail?
So I will tell you based on my example from my hospital. So we are, as a part of a stewardship team, I'm directly influencing prescribing practices together with infectious disease specialists. So when there is no need to prescribe, especially reserved antibiotics for the patient that does not have this indication, because ICU patients are the most difficult patients, and often the physicians want to prescribe the most expensive one. But because they learn I think that ICU doctors, they have a big knowledge on the drugs, but unfortunately when the situation comes, they want to give the all. And then when my antimicrobial stewardship comes, and we just help them to decide on the most rational antimicrobial, and therefore we can reduce we can reduce antimicrobial resistance, and therefore we can, especially now when cholesterol consumption is in rise, and we can help to save these really good antimicrobials for the patients that really need them. So yeah, it's the way to influence them directly, by going there, by talking to the prescribers together as a multidisciplinary effort. So together, pharmacists and doctors, prescribers, infectious disease, microbiologists. But I think that European Union can share these practices, and we have the study from the ECDC that although the physicians, especially in primary care, know that they do not need to prescribe antibiotics, they do, because just to get rid of the patients. And now we have to educate not just the doctors, but the patients as well, not to persuade the doctors to prescribe them antimicrobials. This is one aspect as well. I hope that I answered your question.
Thank you very much, Daria. Yes, indeed, always very important to listen to the voice of the health community and also understand the dynamics with the patients. We have, in the meantime, received another question for Lina on the GMPs. So if GMP are not the most appropriate way to tackle releases from manufacture, what other ways are being considered?
Yes, thank you for the question. The other ways is the scope of the environmental risk assessment to explicitly refer to the antimicrobial resistant risks. And of course, this should be accompanied by guidelines on how to develop what will be the compliance, what do we consider compliance with antimicrobial resistance specific environmental risk assessment. So one point is to add it in the scope, but explicitly, the risks to to address that the environmental risk assessment should address the antimicrobial resistant risks. And the second is to develop the guidelines about this environmental risk assessment for antimicrobials. This is one. And second is to make mandatory for the pharmaceuticals company to disclose information about the sustainability performance of their suppliers. Because as I said, it is very often that the pharmaceutical companies outsource the production, the manufacturing of antimicrobials. And of course, the role of the environmental risk assessment in the market authorization. This is another point. It's not specific to antimicrobials. It's a general question now in the revision of the EU pharma legislation to reinforce the role of the assessment of this, because it is even in the current regulation, it is mandatory for companies to submit in the dossier, in the market authorization application. But what we are thinking now, we are considering is how to enforce this submission of the environment, to make it more important in the market authorization application. This is a general consideration for all medicines.
Thank you very much for that. Also opening the conversation to other speakers, if there's anyone else who would like to add to the answer on this question.
I'll happily add something if that's okay, just in terms of other options, because obviously we have the very formal bureaucratic approaches like legislation or working through well-established systems like WHO have, but there are other ways that, say, bodies like the EU could influence manufacturing as net importers of medicines. And so other options might be something like sustainable procurement, which some countries are already testing out. For example, the Norwegian government was running a pilot in 2019 when they're choosing which antibiotics to purchase, they're including measures on environmental risk within their procurement scorecards and giving more weight to medicines or to companies that are thinking about their environmental impact. So there's other measures like this where it works in a slightly different way. It still would require quite a lot of coordination, certainly between procurers, as you'd have the most impact by coordinating together, and many countries or across the EU requiring the same sorts of measures to exert most influence on manufacturing. But there's different options that different countries can take, rather than, say, waiting for a big structure like WHO GMP to be able to take something like this on. There's something that perhaps could be done perhaps slightly quicker.
Thank you for adding to the pool of options to be considered there, Sean. And now turning to risks, we have received another question which reads, the European Medicines Agency's network strategy to 2025 acknowledges that appropriate measures should be also considered to ensure that environmental aspects of active pharmaceutical ingredient production are taken into account. What measures are being considered within the network in this regard?
I think that's more again of a manufacturing question, and I don't think we have anybody from our sort of manufacturing side here today at the agency. So I personally wouldn't be able to answer that question, but if you could send it, and we could try and send a reply by email to you.
Definitely, let's continue the conversation there then. And in any case, I am afraid time is running out for this current session. So it is time to conclude this exciting discussion. Thank you very much to our great speakers for this excellent first session. And we will now have a small break of 10 minutes. I would kindly ask our speakers to turn off their cameras and mute themselves. And to everyone, please stay connected. The second session will start in 10 minutes at 16:20 Brussels time. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to the annual meeting of the MEP Interest Group on antimicrobial resistance. We had a really insightful discussion before the break and are now approaching the second thematic area of today's event. My name is Jean-Yves Stenwick. I'm from Healthcare Donham Europe, which together with IFA, the European Public Health Alliance, co-host the Secretariat for the MEP Interest Group on AMR with the support of the AMR Stakeholder Network. I will be moderating the second session of this event, which will discuss necessary and cost-effective actions to protect the environment and public health from antimicrobial pollution in the context of revising the list of surface and groundwater pollutants and rules on urban wastewater treatment in the EU. Like during the first panel discussion, we have dedicated an hour for discussion with 4 speakers. They have been invited to share with us some introductory remarks, which will then be followed by a question and answer session. So we'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. So please use the Q&A function to comment and ask questions, and we'll make sure to get back to them in the second part of this panel session. You also have the opportunity to engage on Twitter with the hashtag of the MEP Interest Group, which is hashtag MEP versus AMR. After closing this panel, we will summarize as much as possible the key outcomes of the discussions of panel 1 and 2, and this will be followed by closing remarks by MEP Nicola Stefanuta on behalf of the MEP Interest Group on AMR. So now, without further delay, I'm now turning to our 4 excellent speakers, and our first panelist is Fritjof Laubinger, who is environmental economist at the OECD Environment Directorate. So Fritjof, I invite you to switch on your camera. You are the very recent author of an OECD report published just last week, which is entitled Management of Pharmaceutical Household Waste, Limiting Environmental Impacts of Unused or Expired Medicines. So Fritjof, we are here to hear from you on what needs to be done to ensure proper collection of pharmaceutical and especially antimicrobial household waste to curb inappropriate use and disposal. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Yves, and good day, everyone. Yes, as Jean-Yves said, so my name is Fritjof Laubinger. I'm an environmental economist at the OECD Environment Directorate, and within the Environment Directorate, specifically working on pharmaceutical waste. So this project has been concluded just last week. So last week, we've launched a report on management of pharmaceutical household waste, which can be downloaded on our website. I can also provide the link later. And I would just share with you some insights that come out of that report. So, yeah, I mean, talking about waste, we've heard about quite some different sources and pathways already on how antibiotics can enter into the environment, and thus also how they can contribute to the development of antimicrobial resistant bacteria. We've heard about manufacturing sites and local sources such as hospitals. Then other sources, but also more diffuse sources are, of course, ingested pharmaceuticals that are excreted and then end up in wastewater treatment. And I guess one of my panelists will specifically talk about wastewater treatments. And I wanted to talk with you about another source that can also contribute to the pharmaceutical loading into the environment, and that's pharmaceutical household waste. So when we talk about pharmaceutical household waste, it's specifically the medicines that have been bought or prescribed, but that remain unused in households and thus potentially also expire. But in any case, they will become waste and need to be disposed of. And when those medicines are being disposed of improperly, they can end up in the environment and thus also contribute to the development of AMR. So improper pathways for improper disposal in that sense are 2 pathways. One is pharmaceuticals that are flushed down the toilets or dumped into the sink. And those pharmaceuticals or antibiotics can then end up in the sewage and in wastewater treatment plants and potentially go through wastewater treatment plants and end up in the environment. Another pathway is also pharmaceuticals that are disposed of in solid household waste, because in countries where the solid household waste is not incinerated but destined for landfills, which is certainly the case in quite some European countries, but also looking more globally in non-European countries, those pharmaceuticals can then also end up leaking through the landfill leakage into the environment. And when we talk about this, the amounts are not insignificant. I mean, the studies vary, but studies show that up to 50% of the drugs that have been bought or prescribed can become waste. There's a study in the US, for instance, on opioids that showed that 6 out of 10 patients reported having leftover opioid pills after the treatment ended. And also in France, it was estimated, so the organization that collects pharmaceutical waste estimated that approximately 260 grams are accumulating per capita per year. So that's in 2018, that was 17,600 tons in total. And when you look into the disposal behavior of those pharmaceutical wastes, they vary, but it's certainly clear that quite some of those medicines still end up in the bins or even end up in the toilet and thus in the environment. So proper management of pharmaceutical waste is thus clearly important to as a policy measure to focus on, also to minimize risks of antimicrobial risks of development of antimicrobial resistant bacteria. So as Jean-Yves said, we've done some work on this, and essentially we propose in our OECD report that just came out, we propose 3 measures on how to better manage and control pharmaceutical household waste. One of them as a first measure is to avoid waste from antibiotic leftovers where that is possible. So that's really focusing on waste prevention. And antibiotic waste or just medicine waste more generally can be avoided, for instance, by more precise prescriptions, so shorter prescription cycles, but also looking a bit more targeted into prescriptions of what is needed when, and also with the question of when are antibiotics needed for which treatments, but also smaller packaging sizes, so just prescribing smaller amounts to avoid that unused medicine is remaining after the treatment has completed. There's also some initiatives at the moment to look into marketplaces. So some pharmaceuticals actually already expire or can become waste before they even reach the consumer. So in pharmacies, and there's an initiative in the Netherlands with which is called PharmaSwap, which is looking to better redistribute those unused and unexpired and also unsold pharmaceuticals among pharmacies to avoid that wastage is happening at that stage already. So those are just some initiatives to look into preventing the generation of antibiotic waste. But there's certainly, it needs to be acknowledged that there will always be a certain amount of waste, of unavoidable waste, so of antibiotic waste that is unavoidable, and ensuring proper collection and treatment of this waste is then also important. So separate collection of this, of those unused or expired antibiotics can be useful to reduce 3 risks, essentially. It can reduce the risk of pharmaceuticals being flushed in the toilet. It can reduce the risk of pharmaceuticals and antibiotics ending up in the environment via landfills, if it's being disposed of in solid household waste, and particularly in areas where those solid household waste is not being incinerated. And it can also mitigate some of the risks of abuse or accidents, because it would provide an opportunity for households to dispose of their waste rather than keeping it at home, where it can be consumed accidentally, or it also, when it's disposed of in solid household waste, so in the bins, in the public waste bins, there's also a risk that people go through the bins and find and consume those pharmaceuticals. So all this can be mitigated by organizing a separate collection of pharmaceutical waste. And in fact, quite some countries, also especially looking into the EU, quite some countries have separate collection schemes in place. So where I live, for instance, in France, there's an opportunity to return end of life, so unused medicine, especially unused antibiotics, back to the pharmacies. Pharmacies are usually collection points for this. And we've looked into those different collection schemes. And what we've seen is that, especially when they're organized as part of an extended producer responsibility system, so when essentially through a policy, the industry was made responsible for organizing the collection, organizing and financing the collection and disposal of the unused medicines, this scheme was quite effective in collecting pharmaceutical waste. So examples of where such a scheme is in place is in Sweden, France, Portugal, but also in Spain. So those are two of the 3 points. One is to avoid antibiotic waste where possible, 2, to ensure proper collection. But 3, what's also really important is to raise awareness about proper disposal routes and collections and the existence of collection schemes. So what we've seen and what is also reflected in the disposal behavior, especially in countries where collection schemes are existing, is that awareness is still quite limited among the population. And that is in particularly when looking at medicines overall, that's in particularly for liquid medicines, but also when you look at population groups, studies have shown that particularly younger populations are less aware of how to dispose of unused medicines properly. So in the Netherlands, for instance, a study showed that 17% of the respondents were unaware that liquid medicines should not be flushed into the toilet. And also in Germany, 32% of the respondents would flush liquids at least sometimes, whereas for solid medicines, this number would go down to 10%. So here, those studies just show that, particularly for liquid medicine, that is a risk. But with regards to antibiotics, there's certainly also some lack of awareness among the general population of what to do with the unused medicines when at home. So awareness campaigns are important to complement proper collection systems and to provide information to the public. Those can be just general campaigns, also using social media or just posters or online campaigning. One could also consider providing specific disposal instructions or hand out leaflets. So pharmacies could hand out information leaflets of what to do with unused and expired antibiotics and where to return them where to return them when they're not used. But also, and that's actually also an interesting example in that context, is some pharmacies in Sweden. They are providing nudging opportunities, so they nudge the consumers to return their unused medicine. So they provide some incentives for consumers. Consumers can collect bonus points by returning unused medicine, and those bonus points can then be used in the pharmacies to buy new products. So there's some incentives for consumers to engage in that scheme. So these are all just different examples of how awareness and participation in the scheme can be reached.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this point, Fridtjof. And I would very much encourage everyone who is joining this event to go through the report that you published last week, which I think is really excellent. There's also, I think, a recording of the launch event, which is published on the OECD webpage that I would also encourage everyone to watch. It's full of great solutions, and I think this is an excellent piece of work. You mentioned Sweden several times, and I'm now very glad to turn to our next speaker, which come from Sweden, Jessica Pulfjord, who is a member of the MEP Interest Group on antimicrobial resistance. She will talk about how to promote the research and development of environmentally sustainable antimicrobials and alternatives. So Jessica, I would invite you to turn on your camera and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Jean-Yves. Of course, also a good idea that you have organized this event, and I'm grateful for the invitation and for the possibility to offer some of my thoughts and ideas on these important issues. This is, of course, a very timely webinar and discussion. To tackle AMR at the EU level is important in approaching climate change and improving our environment and public health. It is and should continue to be a key priority in our work. And I would like to share my thoughts on AMR and how we can work to mitigate the risks of antimicrobials to enter our environment. I think it is safe to say that antimicrobials which are entering our environment is one of the biggest challenges in our public health and climate work. Water plays a crucial role in the context of both usage and pollution of antimicrobials. Antimicrobials from water pollution is a major global environment and health challenge. Access to safe water, sanitation and hygiene is one of the most important containment factors for infectious diseases and for good environment. Children are, for example, exposed to resistant infections, but often lack access of safe water, sanitation and hygiene. But this is not an issue with only one solution, but rather requires a comprehensive package of many solutions at the same time. I therefore think it is important to have a holistic view on this. We know, for example, that AMR is a discharge of pollutants derived from human consumption of antimicrobial drugs in healthcare systems and the community, animal consumption in agriculture, and the manufacture of antimicrobial drugs. This results in a vulnerable environment, for example, by having polluted water. This has to change, and here can the EU and we as politicians do a lot, not at least in our different pharmaceutical and environmental strategies. One thing we need to do is to work preventively to mitigate the risks of antimicrobials to enter the environment. It is about to have a strict and sustainable use of, and for this we need a proper framework in the EU. My country, Sweden, like you said, it was already mentioned, but Sweden, for example, have one of the strictest regulations both for human and also for animal for the use in the EU. And I think it is an ambition that should be shared by all countries in the EU. Another very important part of this work is to focus on research and development of environmentally sustainable antimicrobials and alternative antimicrobials so we can have a sustainable use of them. This is what I try to stress here in Brussels, and also stress the importance to embrace innovation and science in our work. We do need regulations and frameworks that will enable the development of new AMR, and the current revision of the Urban Wastewater Directive plays a key part in this work. And I think this is what policymaking should be about. We should always base our policymaking on evidence and facts to get to the best possible outcome. This is something I address and work for here in Brussels in different areas as well as this one. And I also would like to say that EU's policy making should always aim to strive forward, but also be a complement what already works well in our member states and not undermine it. It is important that we analyze and always recognize good national examples that can inspire our policy work in the EU. And I think that is also the political point of view that we could give everyone that is involved with best possible tools to meet the different objectives that the policy making are setting up, and that will happen in a very fair and just way. And I would say that this webinar is, for example, a good idea how to do this and to spread the word and to stress the importance of this issue. And I thank you very much for inviting me, and this was my initial thoughts, and I would like to be a part of the discussion later and discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MEP Pelfjord. And we are actually staying in Sweden. I'm now turning to Anders Finsen, who is environmental advisor at the Swedish Water and Wastewater Association. And this association published last year a report entitled Wastewater Treatment Pains, which notably looks at ciprofloxacin, which is a broad spectrum antibiotic used for severe respiratory and urinary tract infections in Swedish wastewater. So Anders, we talked about the presence of antimicrobial residues in wastewater here. So are wastewater treatment upgrades the silver bullets to curb antimicrobial pollution? And in the end, who should bear the cost? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Yves, and thank you very much for inviting me to this this very interesting panel and to this crucial subject of AMRs in the EU. As Jean-Yves mentioned, my name is Anders Finsen, and today I'm representing Euro, that's the water and wastewater operators of Europe, so the water sector. But I'm based in Stockholm mostly, and I have my daily work at Svenskt Vatten in Sweden. And I have 3 points which I would like to bring up. The first one is, and both Fritjof and Jessica has mentioned that it's really important. The main entrance to the solution is a wiser use and a more prudent use of antibiotics. That is really vital, both for health and for the urban water cycle. And because we do know today that the highest pressure for producing AMRs is in when the antibiotics is used in humans and in animals. So it's really important to be prudent with the use. And Euro supports the actions under the pharmaceuticals in the environmental strategy, especially announced you may remember the guidelines on the prudent use of all pharmaceuticals posing a risk to the environment. I think I even put a quote here that the Commission will promote the development of guidelines for healthcare professionals on the prudent use of pharmaceuticals posing a risk to or via the environment. So that is, of course, the very start of this, the wiser use of antibiotics. Our bullet point number 2 is that maybe not everyone is aware of that, but fecal pollution can explain actually a major part of antibiotic resistance genes in our waters. And so therefore, well-functioning wastewater treatment plants are fundamental with biological treatment. And so this is really, this is why it's so important that wastewater treatment become a global reality under the Sustainable Development Goal 6, and is achieved everywhere in the world. And you may know that ordinary biological wastewater treatment, or as sometimes we call it secondary treatment, is something which only 20% of the global population do have. So it makes a huge difference regarding the risk of spread of fecal bacteria with and without AMR. The fecal bacteria are, of course, produced by us humans in the waters going to the wastewater treatment plant, and it's really important that we, as long as possible, reduce the amount let out to the environment. And 80% of the global population lacks this. And looking to on the European perspective, it's already installed in almost all wastewater treatment plants in the EU and the EFTA countries. That's good to know, and thanks to the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. But we could also have a pressure on the bacteria and the genes to be resistant to antibiotics in the environment. But the biggest production we do have in ourselves, in the humans and in animals, and therefore fecal pollution is so important to take care of. The next step is that but there is still risks that in some up to certain above certain levels of antibiotics in the environment, there could also be a risk of pressure on the genes and therefore the production of AMRs among the pharmaceuticals. And therefore it could be motivated for advanced treatment in some urban wastewater treatment plants. And in those cases, we think from Euro and of course Svensk Vatten, a member of Euro, we think that this advanced treatment should be financed partly or fully by extended producers' responsibility. So these were my 3 points: a wiser use of antibiotics, treat wastewater, and the next one, when we have to go to advanced treatment, in these cases, our policy is extended producers' responsibility should share the costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anders, for these points and for bringing the views of the water and wastewater industry into these discussions. So we are now getting closer to the discussion part of this session. So I would like to remind participants that they have the opportunity to put forward questions to Anders and other speakers using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And it is now my pleasure to hand over to Teresa Lettieri. So we're moving from Sweden to Italy, who is an expert on AMR and the environment at the Joint Research Center, the JRC. And Teresa will provide an overview of the policy measures that are being considered and say a few words also about an excellent article she co-authored last year, which is entitled "Knowledge Gaps in the Assessment of Antimicrobial Resistance in Surface Waters." Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Genevieve. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to join this nice discussion. And as Genevieve explained in the first part of my talk, I am here on behalf of the Commission to explain a little bit more on how and what is doing at policy level to mitigate the ending up of antimicrobials in water. Let me first say that one of the political priority for the Commission is the European Green Deal, under which, of course, the zero pollution ambition goal is one of the main deliverables. And obviously, it's not only related to pharmaceutical, but for all pollutants. The goal is to reach by 2015 the zero pollution to be sure there is no harmful for humans and for the environment. But before that, it was in 2019 that the Commission published and adopted the strategic pharmaceutical to the environment. And this plan included 6 areas, among them the prudent use, which has been already mentioned, the mitigation, so reduce the emission, and I will say a few words in few minutes, monitoring as well. But even before, in 2017, there was the One Health Action Plan, where it was clear that was not enough only human and animals to fight the antimicrobial resistance. The environment should be there. And so I am proud today to be part of this discussion, because at the JRC, we indeed contributing to these aspects for the environmental point of view. Related to the strategic pharmaceutical to the environment, there are several actions. Well, first, to include in the watch list the pharmaceuticals, so antibiotics, and it was already in 2015 where antibiotics were included in the program of measurement for member states, and one of the reasons was indeed to understand the concentration of these antibiotics at European level, and as well the possible contribution to the antimicrobial resistance. The other is the review of the Water Framework Directive, where there are also potential candidates like pharmaceuticals. Then the other policy are the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, also mentioned by Anders, where the idea is also to measure the AMR. As well, there is also ongoing investigation for the sewage sludge directive, where it's not clear, but it's possible, the contribution to the AMR through the manure. But let me also now introduce what Jean-Yves mentioned about the review that we published recently. And this one, because, you know, we discussed about wastewater, the contribution from a hospital, the agriculture runoff, because we should not forget the release of all these pollutants in fresh water. So in water, we have different pressure, not only antibiotics, and I would like also to remind that the resistance could come also from the fungicide for the antifungal treatment, as well other substances can contribute as heavy metals, as a pesticide or like triclosan. So in water, in surface water, we have a multiple pressure, so also the contribution at the same time from different substances, and this may contribute to maintain the resistance coming from wastewater, from resistant bacteria, resistant genes, because the bacteria are continuously under pressure. And so the resistance may acquire also from other bacteria, not only pathogen, which may contribute to maintain the resistance in water, and then later on transfer again to humans. So for this reason, in the review, we identify, let's say, different bulletin point. So the multiple pressure on the bacteria, the co-resistancy, as well, not only from antibiotic, but contribution also from heavy metals. Then the need, of course, to have a harmonized method, as well guidance that should help EU, and not only EU, at global level, what to measure to understand if there is a risk. And related to the risk, so far, for antibiotics and for other substances, is not taking into account the contribution to the antimicrobial resistance. And then the last but not least, we should not forget also about the macroplastic, because macroplastic could also be the carrier of pathogen, carrying the resistance, could be the carrier of substances, then like as well antibiotics, and can be transported from long distance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for these points. And I'm now very happy to open the floor for the panel discussion. So I will invite our four speakers to turn on the camera. And I'm looking at the list of questions here, and the first question comes from Vitalia. I think you have already mentioned this, Fritjof, maybe you'd like to respond again. Do you have an estimation of how much improper disposal of drugs and antimicrobials represent in terms of the total discharge of the pharmaceuticals in the environment? And I will also mix that with another questions that I have prepared for you, because I had a look at the report and I think there were some really good solutions there. One of them being about adapting the packaging size of pharmaceuticals and including antimicrobials. And I thought this was actually a really good point, because a few weeks ago I was sick myself, I had to take antimicrobial drugs. I needed 2 boxes. And actually, I was only consuming, I had to only consume 1 bottle in the house. So I brought the other half of the box to the pharmacy because I'm aware of this issue, but a lot of people might not be. So is there also a need to have some kind of regulation to compel pharmaceutical companies to adapt the packaging size to the need of patients? The floor is yours.
Thank you, John-Yves, and yeah, both really relevant questions. I mean, first to the contribution. So it's a bit difficult to really estimate the exact contribution of what pharmaceutical waste how unused and expired antimicrobials contribute to this, because that really depends on 1, the amounts that are prescribed, 2, the amounts that are being consumed, and then also of what is becoming waste, how those are being disposed of, and whether they're being disposed of in the toilet or so it really depends per country. But I hope to have showed that through the data that I've mentioned, that it's certainly an issue, and it's certainly a waste stream that is contributing to it. And so it should be addressed. Maybe just to put it in relation to medicine that is ending up through the body. So the medicine that is ending up through, so is consumed and excreted, that is certainly a larger amount to what is the unused medicines. However, the unused medicines are the ones that are more cost effective to prevent, because it's in that way a more low-hanging fruit, because they don't end up in they can be prevented from ending up in the sewage waters. Upgrading wastewater treatment plants is really expensive. And comparing this to just organizing a proper collection scheme where people can return them and avoiding that this ends up in the sewage waters is a more effective approach. So it's certainly a significant contribution to look at. And then it's also a more cost-effective way to first reducing the loading of antimicrobials in the environment. So yeah, to the second question, that packaging sizes, that's one of the measures or one of the approaches that we could look into to reducing pharmaceutical waste. And it's true that prescriptions are often, or doctors often prescribe new packaging. There's also often not a question of whether we still have antibiotics sitting at home. So maybe something that we could do is just provide a bit more awareness in this whole prescription method or process, where we have some questions asking, do we still have pharmaceuticals at home? And if they're not unexpired, they're still safe to use. So maybe there's no new prescription needed at that moment. And then also we could certainly look into just dosing the prescriptions. So having smaller prescriptions, so just smaller intervals. And then also, yeah, for sure at the moment, packaging size is a sort of the minimum size, but providing smaller packaging, or also an opportunity as prescription cans. So in some countries you have prescriptions that are just handed out in cans and individual pills. So when it's known that there's just a relatively short treatment, then it might be more useful to prescribe smaller amounts where that is possible. Yeah.
And on this note in particular, I think that France actually recently adopted a new legal text allowing community pharmacists to dispense antibiotics by unit, which might be a good way forward as well to prevent antimicrobial waste or unused antimicrobials. Anders, maybe you wanted to reflect on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Shani. Yes, one of the actually the biggest pharmacy in Sweden just launched their campaign on take back schemes, and they had these bonus points. So thank you very much, Fritjof, to have been that you also mentioned that, and they have also been arguing for having the right type of packaging for antibiotics and other medicines, and it is and they in the launching of the campaign of Take Back scheme, they did a quite a good comparison with food waste and waste, because if you take too much food on your plate, it turns into food waste, and there's a huge environmental the pressure, of course, of that. And the same thing if you buy too many pharmaceuticals, you both produce environmental pressure in the production and also in the waste stream. So they did some parallels there, which was quite good for the launching, I thought.
Thank you, Anders. And actually, my next question was to you. In your presentation, you called for extended producer responsibility schemes to compel the pharmaceutical industry to contribute to the financing of wastewater treatment updates when this was needed to remove pharmaceutical drugs. There is an argument through that wastewater treatment updates might be needed anyway to remove other pollutants. So how do you make the distinctions between what would need to be financed by the industry to remove pharmaceuticals, including antimicrobials, and the updates that would be needed in any case to remove other substances of concern?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jean-Yves. And what we the reasoning we do have is that we will always have pharmaceuticals in the wastewater. Other chemicals, which we probably have to we'll have in the wastewater. They are from industries and in consumers' goods, like maybe PFAS or antibacterial silver. They are not necessary. And we will see them to be phased out, and there's also a very good policy direction in the European Union for that. And but pharmaceuticals, health is always first, and we still have to continue to eat pharmaceuticals. We have to eat them more and consume them more prudent and wiser, but we will still have them in the wastewater. That is why we think that EPR is a scheme we will have. We need it forever for pharmaceuticals, but not for other chemicals. And we are convinced that EPR is good for waste handling, and we see this as I could see in one of the questions they asked to why should the pharmaceutical industry bear this cost. And but then we have the reasoning as we do have for other wastes, like for packaging or bottles. Why shouldn't the waste operator bear this cost and the consumer? We think it's the right way that the producers bear this cost, because then we will have influence in the long run, a more prudent marketing of OTC medicines. We will provide a greener chemistry in the long run. So we think it's the best loop back to connect it with the producers.
Excellent, thank you. I see that Teresa has a hand raised. So Teresa, the floor is yours, and actually my next question will be for you as well.
Thanks. No, I just want to mention a recent work we did on wastewater, where we analyzed the efficiency of removal of some antibiotics. And indeed, some are released downstream in fresh water, including antibiotic resistant genes. So we need a better system for removal. Sometimes maybe it's not possible, and in this case we need a system to monitor what is released in the fresh water. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And you mentioned in your presentation that AMR monitoring might also be included in the revision of the urban wastewater treatment directive. And there was a question here from a participant asking, let me try to find it again, whether resistant genes would be considered as pollutants and so monitored as well in wastewater treatment plants.
Yeah, at the moment there is still ongoing discussion on which exactly which antibiotic resistant genes or which AMR indicator will be included. It is expected the end of this year, the first draft. Maybe Anders was as well involved, and maybe he can tell more. In our case, we in our work we screen for beta-lactam, antibiotic-resistant genes, as well for resistant to macrolides, because erythromycin, clarithromycin, that are also widely used for veterinary purposes. But for sure, beta-lactam is one of the resistant genes because it is widely used and cover the beta-lactam antibiotics. Thank you.
Thank you. I see that Anders has a hand raised, and then I would like to go to MEP Pilchard because I would like to have a views on the regulatory framework as well. So Anders, you come first.
Yes, thank you very much. Very quick. So there's a recently a very nice scientific article regarding the concentration of antibiotics in different kinds of wastewater, where the very highest is from the production of antibiotics. If you don't have treatment, the next one is actually from hospitals wastewater, and then from untreated ordinary wastewater, and then you have from the effluent. And we still could have, I'm sure of that, a pressure also in the environment of the antibiotics still in the treated wastewater, but at the same time, that's what it seems to be when I read the scientific articles is most of the antibiotic resistant genes, they are already produced in ourselves, in the human beings, and transported. So if we could catch the fecal bacteria, and that is ordinary good wastewater treatment, makes a huge difference on that one. And we should be really proud of the treatment we already have in the EU, and we are looking forward to have it improved in the future as well.
Thank you very much, Anders. So I'm now turning on to MEP Pilchard, because in your presentation, you called for a stronger environmental regulatory framework on these issues. And you mentioned Sweden as being a best practice country. And Sweden is often coming up, in discussions around antimicrobials in the environment and pharmaceuticals in the environment more generally. We have an example coming from the OECD report mentioning reward incentives for patients to bring their drugs back to the pharmacies. We know as well that procurement is being used as a tool by public authorities in Sweden to drive sustainability in the pharmaceutical and antimicrobial supply chain. So what is the key takeaway from Sweden, you think might need to be scaled up and used across Europe to reduce the entry of antimicrobials in the environment that are leading to the development of resistance?
Thank you. And what I also stated was that they, of course, it's not just one tool to have the solution for all the problems that we have already addressed and that we can see according to the environmental issues, for example, and what we are discussing here today. So I think that what you have just given as an example is good examples, but we can see that we also work very hard last week I was in the south of Sweden visiting a pig farm where they have worked during a long time for lowering the use of antibiotics and for safeguard the way how they handle the animals, and how you have divided your stable into different compartments, and to see that this will not mix. So in many areas there are a very proper work to see that this will happen, and everything in order to avoid diseases and not use antibiotics as before someone is ill, so to speak. And of course, I also see that there's given examples what we can do in Sweden, and I can also see that this will be a demand from consumers in the future as well, and as not only in the future but quite present as well, to be aware of this. And I think that is a very important part of this also, to raise awareness about what is in front of us, and in the importance, of course. I can also see, if we were talking about the regulatory framework and the directives that we have mentioned, that it is important that it is up to date. What we can see now, for example, the wastewater directive has not been updated or revised in 30 years, and we know that things have happened. And I think also the Commission has already given some partly answers for this, but it is also important to have the possibility for measuring, and we can see during COVID that the water was central for measuring how much the disease and the pandemic was spread and in which areas. So I think that is a good point also, so we can use that as a tool in the future. But I think the awareness and leading by example and spreading the example, and I could see in the chat that someone was asking that this is an cross-border issue. And of course, I can see that if you can lead by example, that would be a good way, but also from the regulatory side, have a good knowledge, and also be flexible where it needs to be flexible. But we can see that this will be an overall EU issue, and when we see what the Commission will put on the table, we can see which part will be covered as well. And of course, it's also important with the research and innovation to see that we can get new antibiotics in the future that would be more environmental friendly.
Excellent. Thank you very much for these points. And thank you as well for highlighting the link with animal health, because obviously antimicrobial discharge from excretion is not only an issue in human health, but also in animal health. So that's why I'm now turning to Teresa. There was a question in the chat about the management of manure. You mentioned discussions around sludge in your presentation. Is there any regulation coming in relation to manure, and how manure, the role that manure plays in the development of antimicrobial resistance in the environment? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, at the moment there is a discussion whether there is a pathway of the resistance coming from the manure use as fertilizer, and how the resistant genes could be also transferred back to human through the food. There is ongoing farm to fork strategy, and for the food security and food sustainability, and AMR is as well one of this topic. So again, the AMR is tackled from different angle, because as you already mentioned, the problem of AMR is not only antibiotic resistance, but is coming through the different exposure. So water, food, and we need really to address in different way. And for this reason, the sewage sludge directive, how we need to investigate if there is a possible contribution as well for the food. And just very quickly about the veterinary use, because we should not forget also about aquaculture. use of antibiotics, although again the Commission aim to reduce by 50% use of this antibiotic for the veterinary use. But we should not forget aquaculture, where you have directing water. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And it's a really good point that you make, highlighting aquaculture and its contribution to AMR, which, as I understood, was not, however, covered by the revision of the Industrial Emissions Directive. Anders, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you very much. A very, very quick comment. There are not many scientific articles on AMR and the risk of building up when using sludge, but the ones that I've seen has not have shown that there is no there seems to be no risk of building up AMR in the soil. So I think I don't know about the situation when manure is used from animals using antibiotics, but I would like to say that the main problem of AMR should be more in the water river with less dilution than in the agriculture soil, but we need more information. Thank you.
Thanks. And I saw that there was a lot of comments about the EPR schemes in the chat here. Obviously, elephant in the room, when we talked about wastewater treatment updates at this advanced treatment, is Switzerland, which has invested a lot in the upgrade of their wastewater treatment plants. So is this a scenario that could also be possible or desirable in other European countries?
Would you like me or Teresa to start?
No, I think Anders, I think you are best placed to answer this one.
Okay, then I think the option from wastewater treatment perspective, which is done in Switzerland, it is a practical way to put together 8 or 12 different contaminants and have an average of 80%. But it is important to know that the control at source work have been quite limited in Switzerland. There is really end of pipe and very little of control at source and upstream measures, which is more the EU type of working, and which we also have in the treaty to work remediate at source and polluters pays principle. So in one sense, the Swiss approach, when you have to have end of pipe treatment, could be good in that sense that it's you put together the most prioritized chemicals and you don't have to measure one by one. But then they have not EPR, and then it's all paid by tax money. And again, I think to have the right connection, it has to be connected back to the producers to fully or partly finance advanced treatment. And looking into AMR again, I think the best solution we can have is well-functioning wastewater treatment plants regarding AMR to treat, to not slip away too many fecal bacteria from hospitals and households, because it's there we have the mainstream of AMR into the water environment.
Thank you very much, Anders. I have also a follow-up question for MEP Pulsfjord, because you talked about innovation and the need to invest further in the research and development of new antimicrobials, especially those that are environmentally sustainable, but also produced by companies that manufacture them in a sustainable way. We've heard about the issue of antimicrobial manufacturing pollution in the first session. And I've read an article you wrote a few months or maybe last year, which was about the need to have public and private partnership to develop these new antimicrobials. So do you think that public authorities should prioritize investments of public money into research innovation of new drugs that are then more sustainable, or are produced by companies that produce them in a sustainable way?
Thank you. of course, there's many things that needs to be prioritized these days. And I think one of the lessons learned after the pandemic and the COVID situation that we have had all over Europe and all over the world is that when we put our mind to something, we can do things together and we can do them faster than they're usually done. And I would also say that shows the strength when we have a public partnership, public-private partnership. And for that reason, I think that is a good idea, even for these kinds of products to be funded in a way that we can share the burden, so we can have products in the market and maybe even in shorter amount of time. Because I met with the industry today and also asked what we have learned from the pandemic, and I think this is one of the important lessons learned, that we can, if we do it together, and we can share costs and even research and innovation, we can see that we can have a strong we have a strong platform for the future. So of course, as you said, if we should prioritize this or but I think what we have always say that this is a silent threat. I think this is one of the most prioritized issues for the future. So I think that will be something that we from our side at least would see more of in the coming years, and also that it will have a good that the Commission, when they will present the new strategy, also have this in consideration to give it a good opinion.
Great, thank you very much, MEP Pelchard, for this response. And I'm afraid that we do not have more time to continue this discussion. But before summarizing the key points we heard, I would like to first thank our excellent panel for the excellent contribution to today's discussions. And our thanks go also to active audience for their attention and for all the questions and comments we received. So I would invite panel members to now switch off the camera, and I will give the floor back to my colleague Christina, who will sum up the key points from the first session, and then it will be my task to do the same for the second one before giving back the floor to MEP Stefanuta.
Thank you very much, Janiv. Not an easy task, but I will indeed attempt to highlight some of the many interesting points raised in the first half of today's conversation. We first heard from David Braham, Professor of Ecosystems Engineering at Newcastle University, who explained that AMR primarily develops in the gut due to antimicrobial use, but transmission and spread is driven by other factors, including environmental ones. He mentioned that Europe is the region with the lowest AMR level per capita, but the AMR exposure risk across Europe remains, with wide variations between member states due to different levels of antimicrobial use, incomplete coverage of effective waste management, variable dilution in receiving water, and combined sewer overflows. Then in the first panel session, we started with an overview from Pascalia Kufo-Kotsiu, talking about the current EU regulatory framework, where environmental risk assessments do not cover manufacturing emissions, nor the risks of AMR development and spread in the environment. The Commission is considering extending the scope of environmental risk assessments to risks of production and to risks of AMR development and spread. However, there is still a lack of consensus about the exact contribution of antimicrobial manufacturing to the development of AMR in the environment. The second panelist, Sean Williams, Senior Policy Advisor at the Wellcome Trust, gave a quick overview of 3 possible regulatory options to curb antimicrobial manufacturing pollution. Introducing legislation to set limits for antibiotic discharges coming from pharmaceutical plants, including antibiotic discharge limits in the WHO Good Manufacturing Practice Framework, and including environmental metrics in antibiotic procurement. Wellcome Trust also estimated the economic impact of regulation on manufacturing and antimicrobial discharges. The study suggested that most antimicrobial supply chains are resilient enough to take in environmental regulation, with particular attention needed, nevertheless, for molecules treating niche indications, notably. MEP Sara Sertash highlighted that not enough has been done to address AMR. There is a crucial need to push the One Health approach to make the EU a best practice region and advocate for AMR to be higher on the global agenda. AMR is a major global health challenge. The innovation pipeline of antimicrobials is getting dry, and we are close to the point of no return. There is a need to establish effective barriers in human health and animal health to prevent discharges of antimicrobials in the environment. Then our fourth speaker and panelist, Chris Wimsley from the European Medicines Agency, explained that AMR is not currently part of the environmental risk assessment for medicine authorizations. ERAs are looking at effects on the environment, but not at AMR development. It would be of great benefit to clarify these aspects in the review of the pharmaceutical legislation. Finally, Daria Kurutspoye, Director of Professional Development at the European Association of Hospital Pharmacists, brought the perspective from the ground, highlighting how antimicrobial stewardship teams can help change prescription practices and promote best practice sharing. These interventions are, however, not routine in European healthcare institutions. Vaccinations and improved hygiene are additional supportive measures. This has been a brief overview of the remarks in the first session, and many thanks once again to everyone for their interest and active participation. And I will now give the floor back to my colleague Jean-Yves for the summary of the second session.
Thank you very much. It's also a difficult job to summarize the points from the second session. But first of all, we heard from the OECD representative who highlighted highlights from the report that was launched last week, looking at pharmaceutical household waste, which is an important source of pharmaceutical pollution. And that means the medicines that remain unused in households and need to be disposed of. So he highlighted different improper disposal methods, such as flushing down the medicines, including antimicrobials, on the toilets, or to dump them in the sink, or to include them in solid household waste. And the OECD proposes 3 measures to better manage and control pharmaceutical household waste, which is waste prevention, such as more precise prescription or smaller packaging. The OECD is also calling for proper collection and treatments of household waste, and finally to raise awareness of proper collection and existing schemes, take-back schemes. We then heard the perspective from MEP Pilfjord, a member of the MEP Interest Group, who highlighted antimicrobials in the environment as one of the greatest challenges we're facing today in relation to antimicrobial resistance, and highlighting that obviously this is not an issue with only one solution, but instead that a holistic view was essential given the interlinkage between human and animal and the environment. And prevention is also a key component of the solution to address AMR in a holistic way, with a need for a proper EU framework, while also taking into account the need to recognize good national example, such as in Sweden, where stricter regulations on both the use of antimicrobials by humans and by animals led to decrease of antimicrobial resistance. She also highlighted the need to further invest in research and development, and that policymaking should be evidence-based. We then heard from Anders Finnsson from the Swedish Water and Wastewater Association, who highlighted 3 main points. The first one is linked to the prudent use of antimicrobials and the support for the guidelines on prudent use drafted by the Commission. Then the fact that wastewater treatments needs to become a global reality achieved all over the world, and that fecal pollution is an important issue to be taken care of. And then he highlighted the fact that when needed, advanced treatment methods should be funded by extended producer responsibility schemes. We then heard the perspective coming from the GRC, was also speaking on behalf of the European Commission in this session from Teresa Lettieri, who said that obviously the zero pollution ambition is one of the key priorities of the European Commission in the framework of the European Green Deal, and that prudent use of antimicrobial, but also mitigation of emissions and monitoring should be looked at to contribute to the goal set in the Zero Pollution Action Plan. She also mentioned the EU One Health Action Plan that was published a few years ago, and she highlighted the fact to also look further at the environmental aspect in relation with both human and animal aspects. And she also highlighted different policy frameworks, such as the strategic approach to pharmaceuticals in the environment, as well as the revision of the list of priority substances and the revision of the urban wastewater treatment directive, mentioning that AMR monitoring was considered in the revision of this specific piece of regulation. So time is already running by, so I'm now giving the floor back to MEP Stefanuta, and I will invite him to take the floor and give concluding remarks.
Thank you. So thank you to Christina and to Jean-Yves for the summary of today's session. Our discussion today shows that the presence of antimicrobials in the environment is far too crucial in the development and spread of AMR to be ignored, and we must pay close attention to this if we really want to tackle antimicrobial resistance. Many speakers today have made the case for the EU to ensure, sorry, my little daughter is trolling me for the moment, to ensure that antimicrobial exposure in the environment is addressed throughout their life cycle, from production through the end use in humans, animals, and crops. So in order to be a global leader on AMR, the EU must ensure a true One Health approach to this major cross-border health threat, preventing AMR development, transmission, and spread. So the debate today, I think, made clear to me that we need more action to ensure that the environmental dimension of AMR is addressed, including a stronger regulatory framework, systematic environmental monitoring in water bodies and spoil and wastewater treatment facilities, as well as behavioral changes from all stakeholders to ensure responsible production, prudent use, and appropriate disposal. Myself and other colleagues in the MEP Interest Group on AMR will continue to follow closely the development of these policy files, and because we need to raise political and public awareness and advocating for ambitious measures, including to the review of EU general pharmaceutical legislation. Now, with that, our event has come to an end today. It was very interesting to listen to everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our excellent speakers for their valuable time and contributions to these very engaging discussions. So I would also like to thank our audience and also the Secretariat of the AMR Interest Group. And we have an exciting agenda for the rest of the year. Please follow the MEP versus AMR hashtag on Twitter to make sure you don't miss the moments. Wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you.